We're going to now turn to our fourth speaker, Jeffrey Deskovic. I met Jeff actually 10 years ago. It's hard to believe it's already been 10 years. And it was at Marty wasn't there because he was still incarcerated, but at the oral arguments that were part of the 19th and ultimately successful appeal that led to Marty's freedom. And Jeff had gotten out not that long beforehand and went as a show of support. And it really is something that he has done tirelessly for the last 10 years. Now, I want to mention one thing about Jeff's case in particular, because what it highlights is how powerful the word confession is in a court of law. Because when Jeff was convicted in 1990, they had early DNA testing. And they tested the DNA, and it was a horrific rape murder case of a girl in his high school. And they tested the DNA, and it was not Jeff. And that went into trial. But the jurors believed the confession over the DNA. And it took 16 and a half years of him tirelessly working to have that DNA retested and have it be put into the now existing database that could provide a match to who the real perpetrator was. And they denied every request of his over and over and over. And finally, when he was able to get it tested, it turned out to be a match to someone else who had actually murdered another person during the time when Jeff was incarcerated for that first conviction. So it's extraordinary what it shows about the power of a confession in the court of law. Jeff, I've really enjoyed getting to know him over the past 10 years. When I saw him, he'd just gotten out, and he was struggling. I think there's no doubt about that. It was a hard adjustment for him. But since then, it's been an incredible pleasure and joy to see him grow and thrive. He went on to get his BA from Mercy College, his MA from John Jay College of Criminal Justice. He's become a national spokesperson on criminal justice reform, on wrongful convictions, on false confessions. He's given over 100 presentations around the country. He's authored over 200 articles that have come out in all sorts of different publications, including CNN, Al Jazeera, New York Times, Wall Street Journal. And he's also been lobbying political officials, particularly in New York, but in New York, DC, in Connecticut, also in Washington, D.C. on a national level. He's testified in hearings in many parts of the country. He's an extraordinary leader for this movement, and I'm very happy that he could join us tonight. I'm happy to introduce him to you here. Jeff.
Good evening. I need more energy than that. Good evening. All right, it's great to be free. So I'm going to start off, I'm going to discuss my own false confession, which I think is instructive, and then I'll move on to what the red flags are that indicate that a confession may be false. I'll turn to the discussion about what reforms could be done in order to prevent wrongful convictions caused by coerced false confessions, and I'll close by giving some practical advice, because I think that we should all have a takeaway, something that we can activate and utilize from this. So I went to the police station on a school day. Because it was a school day, neither my mother nor my grandmother with whom I lived, they didn't realize that anything was wrong, and so hence they did not call around looking for me. I was driven to the town of Brewster, which was in Putnam County, whereas I was a native of Peekskill in Westchester County. The significance of my sharing that with you is that meant I was no longer able to leave on my own. I was instead dependent upon the police. They put me in a small room. I did not have an attorney present. I wasn't given anything to eat the entire time I was there. There were 3 officers there who I knew were officers, but then there was also the polygraphist, who was a Putnam County Sheriff's investigator who was dressed as a civilian who was pretending not to be a cop. Before attaching the polygraph machine to me, the polygrapher gave me countless cups of coffee. It seems fairly clear in hindsight that the purpose of giving me all of this coffee was to get me nervous. Following that, the polygrapher strapped me into the lie detector machine. They played the game known as good cop, bad cop, in which an officer pretends to be a friend who's somehow powerless to intervene, yet his partner is the bad cop who's really aggressive. And of course, the purpose of this tactic is that when a person is being questioned and becomes nervous, it's only natural that you would look to a friendly face for assistance. So after attaching this polygraph machine to me, the polygrapher launched into his third-degree tactics. He invaded my personal space. He raised his voice at me. He kept asking me the same questions over and over again. As each hour passed, so too did my fear increase in proportion to the time. He kept us up for between 6.5 to 7 hours. Towards the end of the interrogation, the polygrapher made a statement to me. He said, "What do you mean you didn't do it? You just told us through the test results that you did. We just want you to verbally confirm this." When he said that to me, that really shot my fear through the roof. At that point, the officer who was pretending to be my friend, he came in the room and told me that the other officers were going to harm me, but that he was holding them off, but could not do so indefinitely. You have to help yourself here, you understand. Considering that I had maintained my innocence for the previous 6.5 to 7 hours, it was fairly clear what he meant by that. They wanted me to confess. When it was added that if I did as they wanted, not only would they stop what they were doing, but that I could go home afterwards, being young, naive, frightened, 16 years old, not thinking about the long-term implications, just being in fear of my life, I was painfully aware of the fact that nobody knew where I was. I didn't even know where I was. I was totally overwhelmed emotionally and psychologically. And at the same time, there's this push-pull dynamic in play, in which on one hand the possibility of harm has been introduced, and on the other, this officer has thrown me this false life preserver, telling me that if I did as they wanted, that I was not going to be arrested. Just trying to get out of the interrogation room, never thinking anything beyond that. I made up a story based upon information which they had given me in the course of their interrogation. By the police officer's own testimony, by the end of the interrogation, I was on the floor in a fetal position, crying uncontrollably. Needless to say, I was arrested. I was charged with a murder and rape. My interrogation was not videotaped. It was not audio taped. There was no signed confession. It was just the police officer's word as to what happened. Because of this lack of objective record, the cops were able to lie during their testimony and leave out the two crucial facts, which were the two illegal things that they had engaged in, which was the threat and the false promise. What are the red flags associated with false confessions? Those would include the length of an interrogation, particularly when combined with food deprivation, the misuse and abuse of the polygraph, certainly the age of the person being questioned. False confession experts have determined that youth are a particularly vulnerable population, although normal adults have given false confessions as well. People with mental health issues are also particularly susceptible to false confessions because the way that people with mental illnesses compensate for their mental illness is they try to be compliant with authority figures. When that authority figure is law enforcement seeking to get a confession, that's a recipe for injustice. If the facts of a confession are if the statements in a confession are in opposition to known external evidence, then that's a clear red flag. So in my case, for example, I made a statement and I said that I hit the victim over the head with a Gatorade bottle. But a Gatorade bottle would be incapable of inflicting the type of injuries that the medical examiner said the victim suffered. There was no shattered glass at the scene, nor were there any shards of glass found in the victim's body. If the level of language that is used exceeds the formal education and life experience of the suspect, then that's another red flag. If a confession is written by law enforcement rather than by a suspect, then that's a red flag. If a police officer is asking yes/no questions as opposed to asking open-ended questions in which somebody who actually did commit the crime would have to fill details in. So if those just yes/no questions rather than open-ended, then that's also a red flag. If an interrogator incorporates an item, a piece of information about the crime into a question, and then not too long after that in the dialogue that follows, the verbal exchange that follows, the suspect then incorporates that item into the confession, then that's another red flag. If it's a co-defendant situation, if the co-defendants tell different stories, then that's yet another, that's another red flag. The police giving details of a confession is a red flag. Law enforcement is supposed to withhold certain crucial key elements, both from the public as well as from the person being questioned. That information is supposed to be used as a safeguard so that when a confession is given, it can be evaluated whether or not the non-public information is contained in the confession or not. But when those details are given either inadvertently or deliberately, then contaminations occurred. And so if that happens, that's another red flag. Case in point, anyone who wants to focus in on Brandon Dassey, which Professor Howard showed earlier, at one point the officer, I guess he's just out of frustration, he volunteers to the suspect. After asking what happened to the victim's head and not getting the right answer because it's obviously a false confession, he volunteers. She was shot in the head, right? Well, that's an example of sharing a crucial non-public fact. That's a huge red flag. So having known about what these red flags are, is there no way to utilize that knowledge that we've arrived at only through the painful lessons of wrongful convictions caused by coerced false confessions? What are the reforms that we can utilize to prevent wrongful convictions from occurring based on coerced false confessions? Well, the first thing is that instead of just simply having a pretrial hearing at which the sole issue is voluntariness of the statements, which is what we have now, we should additionally have a hearing before a confession could be used as evidence, in which the judge is looking at the accuracy, the truthfulness of a confession, using those red flags. Each one of those is not something made up. It's not something that I think. These are lessons which are extracted from cases that ultimately terminated in a exoneration through DNA, but only after significant time was spent. So if a judge was to evaluate these factors and before a confession could be used, I think that we could reduce the number of wrongful convictions caused by coerced false confessions. Allowing false confession expert testimony in the courtroom is key. The experts do not give an opinion on whether a particular confession is coerced and false. That's something that's the province of the jury or the judge if it's a bench trial. Instead, the experts give crucial contextual information as to what the factors are that would lead an innocent person to confess. That's very important because that's not common knowledge, that's specialized knowledge that's arrived at after study, and so therefore ordinary citizens can't be expected to know that. But the jury is made up of ordinary citizens, so the expert could provide that contextual information. The jury could decide, based on those factors, whether that particular confession is false or not. Maybe it's not false, but they have to have that crucial information to make that assessment. Lastly, it's been emphasized already, but it has to be repeated, the importance of videotaping the entire interrogation, both from the beginning and from the beginning to the end, not just simply the part at which the suspect confesses, but from the moment the custodial questioning begins all the way to the end. No selectively starting and stopping the videotape. What is there to hide? And with the camera fully focusing on both the interviewer as well as a person being questioned. There are examples of people being wrongfully convicted despite the videotaping, and that's why those other reforms are important, that the videotaping might be the centerpiece, but without those other pieces of the package, the building is not quite fully built. To close out, just to give a little practical information, a takeaway, something to be able to know and utilize. I don't think that it's really known by most of us what to do if a police officer wants to question you. You know, false confession experts have determined that the innocence of a suspect often works against them, because the thought process, someone who's innocent, is that if you're innocent of the crime and you don't know anything about it, you know, why would you need to assert your rights? What could possibly happen if you talk to the police? But I think as you've sat here and looked up on the stage, you can see that quite a bit could actually happen if you decide to go down that wrong road. What you should do if the police want to question you is you give your pedigree information, what your name is, where you live. And the third thing that you need to say is, I want a lawyer. There's nothing that law enforcement needs to speak to you about that's so crucial, so time sensitive, that it can't wait for them to give you a lawyer and then proceed. The lawyer will level the playing field. The lawyer will prevent you from being coerced and overwhelmed. They won't dare to do the tactics they engaged in on any of the people on the stage tonight. That's very important. You should share that information with people who, for whatever reason, weren't able to make it tonight. There's too many people, there's too many of us that we waive our rights and we really don't understand what we're doing. We don't really understand what it means to knowingly, willingly, and intelligently waive our rights. Thanks a lot for listening. Thanks for coming out.